Greetings, I'm Markia, and this is the Something Scary podcast. To our veteran listeners and those voyaging into the dark with us for the first time, welcome. Close-knit communities can foster strong relationships and make great memories, but like anywhere else, they can also lead to isolation, resentment, and dismay. This week, we make our way out of the city and into the countryside to investigate small town terrors. First, Sapphire tells an ancient Navajo legend that might still have some truth to it. Next, I'll recount the night when 3 siblings were home alone on an isolated farm. After that, we'll make a new friend in Romania with some strange abilities. And finally, we'll take a trip to Paraguay and have Grandpa tell us a local legend. I receive hundreds of creepy story submissions every single week. As always, the first story you hear is one that we've chosen to animate and post over at youtube.com/snarled. Then, I read a few more stories for the podcast. If you have a tale you're dying to share, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, consider joining our Patreon. Our patrons play a huge role in keeping the show running every single week. For more information on how you can help the show and also be a part of it, visit patreon.com/snarled. So, want to hear something scary? Click, click.
The following story was inspired by a submission from Ellie. Legend has it that in a rural Navajo town called Many Farms, there was once a fruit tree orchard behind the lake. The town's less fortunate would steal from it late at night when the owner was asleep. When he finally caught on, the owner was so angry that he asked the devil to turn him into a tall, hairless, and incredibly fast monster to scare away the thieves. The orchard may be gone now, but all the town's elders claim that the monster is still there, waiting to attack anyone who comes near his property. Click, click, shh, they'd say. That's the sound he makes, like a horse clicking and dragging his feet. If you ask any of the townspeople about this legend, they'll tell you about a man named Coy. He was working for a construction company building a new gas station. If the work went into the night, he was paid overtime, so some nights he would stay as late as 3 a.m. But every morning, his grandmother, who he lived with, would beg him to come home earlier because she was afraid of the click-click shh. Coy would always laugh her off. Does it sound like this, Grandma? He'd tap his cheap, oversized boots twice on the ground and drag them, while chuckling at his poor grandma's reaction. You listen to me, young man. Something lives by that lake. I've heard it, she'd insist. But he'd pretend not to hear her as he ran off for work. One night, when he was working late, a pair of elders on his crew began trading their own stories. The first described in eerie detail a tall figure with jaundiced yellow eyes that crept through the trees along the lake, watching him. The other claimed he'd run for his life once after fishing at the lake at night. Coy found himself taking a pause in his drilling work to hear the stories. When his foreman walked up and told him to get back to work, "Sorry if we scared you," the first elder said. "Those old stories don't scare me," Coy replied. But seeing the fear in his eyes, the first elder gave a knowing nod. That night, driving home from work, Coy's truck suddenly shut down. The battery had died, which meant he would have to walk the rest of the way home. As he started the 5-mile trek, he noticed the beauty of the moon shining down on the lake and chuckled to himself about the elder's stories. And that's when he heard it. Click, click, shh. Coy stopped and turned around, but nothing was there. He walked on, and there it came again. Click, click, shh. Thinking it must be the elders from work messing with him, Coy stopped and said, "Very funny. You can come out now." Click, click, shh. Coy turned again to see a figure in the tree line. It was tall and shaped like a human. Growing angry, Coy slung a rock at it when, suddenly, it charged at him. Terrified, Coy ran for his life. The click-click followed his exact footsteps. He ran faster and faster, but the monster was catching up. As the end of the lake came into view, he was certain he'd be safe if he could just get to the other side. But then, Coy's oversized boots came loose, and he tripped and fell over. He heard the click, shh, as he turned to see its piercing yellow eyes and 6-inch claws glistening in the moonlight. He was tall, at least 7 feet, and his pale, hairless skin was covered in scars and goosebumps. His mouth looked like a shark's, several rows of teeth protruding. Coy looked up at the monster and whispered, "I'm sorry, grandmother." No one saw Coy ever again, or so they say. So pay a visit to many farms. You just might hear the click, shh in the night. But if you do, don't bother running. You won't be fast enough.
Remember being home alone for the first time? That sense of freedom is immeasurable, but so is the dread. After all, if something goes wrong, who will come to save you? In this next story, inspired by Tori, she tells us that exact situation. 16-year-old Tori lived in a tiny, idyllic farm town in Iowa with her parents, 2 younger siblings, a brother named AJ, a sister named Lily, and their feisty family dog, Moxie. They would all work together on the small farm their parents owned. One week, Tori's parents had to leave state for a funeral, so it was up to Tori to watch the house and take care of business. As Tori's dad packed his suitcase, he took his daughter aside and told her one single instruction. "I know we live far away from things, and we kind of got this open door policy going on, but when me and your mother are gone, I want that front door locked until we come back. You understand me?" Tori nodded confidently. With a quick kiss and a hug to all the kids, Tori's parents were in the truck and off down the road. Little AJ and Lily were bouncing in excitement on the front porch. Lily rushed inside, causing the family dog Moxie to bark and trail her through the house. Lily sang to herself, "No mom, no dad, no rules." Tori spun around to grab her sister, but she was too quick. Meanwhile, AJ was already putting on his boots and grabbing his wagon. There was barely any time to grab both of them. Lily burst out of the house in fresh overalls. Moxie chased after, leaving the front door swinging open. Lily kept up on her song, to the fields. Come on, let's explore." AJ started booking it too, and Tori didn't want them to get hit by a car, so she quickly chased behind. "Wait up, you knuckleheads." Tori chased them to the cornfields a bit down the way. Her stern attitude melted into a carefree glee as she ran with her siblings. She could hear their happy giggles and see their wide smiles. They just wanted a little fun. What's the harm in that? Tori decided not to haul them away immediately. She let them have their fun as the sun started setting around them. The crickets' chirping suddenly stopped as Lily shouted, "Hey, there's something in here." Tori's heart started pounding. Was it a snake? She took a step forward when she noticed the corn stalks. They were shaking out in the field, like something was crawling around beneath them. The stalks mellowed out, and then a violent ripple shot out around them. Something was running through the field. Moxie, barking, went running after it. "Hey, it's heading towards our house," AJ remarked. Tori looked at their lone house in the distance, all empty, with the front door wide open. Tori grabbed AJ's hand and started walking. "Lily, come on, we're going home," she said. Lily noticed the fear in her sister's voice and joined her siblings on the road. Tori's anxious walk turned into a panicked run as she heard Moxie make it into the house. The dog was growling. There was a loud crash, then whimpering. Her run became a sprint as she made her way up the driveway. The front door was closed. Something was in the house. Lily and AJ followed up the porch steps with Tori, watching nervously as their big sister tried the handle. The door was locked. AJ tugged Tori's arm and pointed around the house. "The back door." The trio ran around and peered through the windows. It was dark now, and the lights were off. All they saw inside was darkness. AJ made it to the back door and tried the handle, locked as well. They could hear Moxie whimpering inside again. Tori trembled. What was going on? Was something in their house? A voice broke her train of thought. I'll unlock the door. Lily was crouched down, barely fitting through the doggy door near the bottom. Lily, wait. But before she could stop her, Lily was through. Tori and AJ listened through the door as Lily stood up, causing a squeaky floorboard to creak. Whatever was in the house stopped moving. And then it rushed towards the back door. Lily screamed as something ran into her, slamming the back door. Tori could hear her sister struggling, so she braced herself and kicked at the old door. It opened up into the dark house. The last thing Tori and AJ saw was their sister screaming as she was dragged into the darkness. Tori and AJ quickly entered and flicked on the light. The room lit up. It was in shambles. Something had ripped the place apart, searching through every nook and cranny. Dressers overturned, chairs in pieces, and there in the center of the room stood the culprit. Tall and lanky with wiry limbs. It looked like a cornstalk come alive, like some mutant had disguised itself as the crop, with a slender green body and a yellow mop of hair covering its face in an oval. 2 massive white eyes poked out of the hair and stared down at Lily. It had clawed feet, and Lily was being gripped by one, pinned down between 2 of its sharp talons. It looked malnourished and rabid. Its green stomach undulated rapidly, and its arms were small nubs wriggling towards Lily on the floor. Tori's jaw trembled at the creature as its little nubs shot out, revealing slimy intestine-like arms wrapping around her sister. Tori grabbed a nearby shovel and sprinted towards the creature. She shut her eyes and swung. The shovel hacked through the arms, releasing Lily and causing the creature to bleed all over the room. It skittered around the furniture, yelping in pain. The creature tumbled over AJ as it sprinted off into the night, back into the cornfield. Tori dropped the shovel and held her sister tight. AJ walked up to the 2 sisters, cradling Moxie in his arms, who panted in exhaustion. Moxie suffered a couple of hits, but I think she's okay. Without saying anything, Tori brought her little brother and dog into the group hug. They all cradled each other as Moxie licked their faces. The 3 siblings cleaned up the house as best as they could. AJ patched up Moxie and stayed with her all night. Lily slept together with them in the bedroom upstairs. Tori inspected different areas of the house. In the kitchen, she found the fridge wide open and most of the food gone. She shuddered, remembering the ferocity of the beast, and closed the fridge. But most importantly, she locked every door in the house. As AJ and Lily settled in for the night, Tori locked the back door. Through the window, in the shadow of the moonlight, she spotted one cornstalk, taller than most. It slowly rose up, getting taller and taller. 2 white eyes stared out through the top. Its little nubs wriggled in the darkness. It stood there, waiting for Tori to leave. Tori leaned against the dresser and brandished the shovel in her hands. It was going to be a long night, but she wasn't going anywhere. For 3 nights, Tori stood ever vigilant. The more she guarded the windows, the more it seemed like the creature had gone away. Each night, its eyes appeared farther and farther away, until the 4th night, it wasn't in the field. Their parents finally came home. They seemed exhausted, but Tori had to tell them everything that had gone on. The parents believed someone had broken in, but not a mutant stalk of corn. A police report was filed. Tori was scolded for leaving the door unlocked, and that was the end of that. But not for Tori. She knew what was still out there, and every night, even if the creature hadn't shown its face, she'd stand watch. She would do anything to protect her younger siblings, because that's what a big sister does. Wow, Tori, that is an absolutely frightening experience. I wonder what we would do if we knew a monster was waiting for you to leave your home. I mean, there's always that feeling that there might be something out there, but Tori knows for certain. Does anybody out there normally leave your front door unlocked? I always feel like I always lock mine, but I don't live in a small town. All I can think of is that there's probably one night that Tori would end up falling asleep. I mean, how long can you possibly stay up night after night, waiting for a monster that could come back whenever it wanted to? And then also, one day, Tori's going to leave the farm, isn't she? College or moving into her own place. What would happen to her family then? Big cities like to believe they have all the action. But in this next story, inspired by Joanna, sometimes all it takes is one person to bring the thrills, for better or for worse. My name is Joanna, and I lived in Madeios, Romania. Life was slow here, but in a peaceful sort of sense. I was a photographer, and I loved taking pictures of the sleepy rolling landscapes. It was simple and easy, but I always longed for something a little more. Every month, my boyfriend would come and visit me for the weekend. His name was Adrian, and he was from Cluj-Napoca. I could listen to him talk about that city for hours. The museums, the vibrant nightlife. Adrian and I would discuss moving there once I was out of school. He'd talk about the amazing sights and pictures I could take. We could even travel across Romania, out of Romania. All I had to do was make it through the year and graduate. When Adrian would leave, things would go back to normal. I walked my usual route one day when I decided to mix it up. Our town had spots in it that weren't well maintained, so there was also a lot of opportunities for pictures of urban decay. An abandoned school nearby rarely had any visitors, and I had never seen any police hanging around, so I decided to go inside. The place was dusty and appeared to have suffered a fatal collapse many years ago, so I treaded carefully. Still, it was a great place to take some very eerie pictures. Suddenly, I heard someone humming down the hall. I panicked and took a wrong step, tripping over some bricks. The humming stopped, and I heard someone stepping over to me. I felt them grab my arm and help me up. "Easy there. Don't want to go down with the rest of this building," she said. It was some girl. Her face was a great big smile with rosy cheeks. Her dark blonde hair hung a little wild about her shoulders. But better yet, she looked out of the ordinary. "I didn't know other people came in here. Sorry for disturbing you," I said. "No worries. I'm glad you came." "The name's Mihaela," she responded. We got to talking and clicked almost instantly. We had similar interests and aspirations. She wanted to see the outside world as well. Still, she enjoyed the quietness of the area, just like me. Apparently, she came to this building to heal her body. She was into rituals, which was fine by me. Me and Mihaela made it a plan to meet there after school every day. Suddenly, I found a new thing to pull me back to Madeios. Mihaela was awesome. We chilled in the abandoned school until late night after night. And with no time at all, Adrian was back in town. I was so excited to introduce him to Mihaela. We went into the abandoned school and found her in the middle of one of her rituals. She seemed a bit shocked at the sight of my boyfriend. "Mihaela, I want to introduce you to Adrian, my boyfriend," I laughed. But Mihaela didn't respond. She just glared. "So you're the one trying to make her leave me?" Madeios. The awkwardness hung in the air, so I quickly set us down for lunch. Mihaela just frowned and didn't take any bites. After a silent meal, we got up to go. But Mihaela suddenly came to her senses and shook Adrian's hand goodbye. "Sorry for being rude. I'm just shy and, it's nice to meet you." We both smiled and bid Mihaela farewell. On our walk home, we talked about hanging with Mihaela more. But then Adrian started coughing. Started off calm, but got more guttural. Then he crouched down and spit up blood. I rushed him off to the nearby hospital. Adrian's shape seemed to deteriorate as we got closer. His gait became a limping walk. His nose and ears started bleeding, and the worst part of all, his limbs seemed to bend like rubber under his own weight. We got him set up in a gurney, and as we wheeled Adrian away from me, he reached out with his disfigured hand. On his palm, I could see a dark red burn, right where Mihaila had shook his hand. I knew it was a crazy idea, but Adrian had been fine before our lunch. Mihaila couldn't have done this, but maybe she noticed something? I didn't want to think too far down that trail of thought, but I did need to see her. We'd only met at one place, so I ran back to the abandoned school, this time taking the back entrance. As I marched through the dark halls, I noticed small valedictorian portraits hung up nearby. One of them caught my eye. It was a girl with dark blonde hair, a little wild around her shoulders. She smiled wide with rosy cheeks, and next to her face was the name, Mihaila. I grabbed the portrait for a better look. The date at the bottom read 1972. "How's he doing?" Mihaila said. I spun around. She was right there. "What did you do to him?" I shouted. I needed to transfer my death to someone. My essence was tied to this building, and through my rituals, I found a way to live again. The catch, I needed to finish the ritual before the building finally came down. The transfer is almost complete and just in time. She chuckled as some more plaster shook loose around us. "Don't look so sad. I was going to use you, but then your boyfriend came along, and I kind of liked you, Ioana. So I thought I'd let you live." Mihaila was walking closer to me. The walls around me were shaking. Dust fell from the ceiling. "What are you talking about?" I delayed. "Don't play dumb. You saw my portrait. I was set to get out of here just like you, but then this stupid building came crashing down on me, January 14th, 1972. The closer Mihaila got, the more her face looked demonic. Her eyes were dark red slits and her voice got deeper.
"I'm feeling better, more alive already. Poor Adrian probably feels the weight of this entire building coming down on him."
Chunks of the building were dropping down now. I had to dodge some of them as Mihaila got within reach. She grabbed my neck and spoke low.
"I've accelerated the ritual. I will be free of this cage in this town. Will you stand in my way?"
I slashed Mihaila across the face with the sharp edge of the portrait. She screamed and let me go. The energy around Mihaila pulsed as the building continued to crumble around us. I had to leave now, but if the building didn't fall before her ritual was done, Adrian would die in her place. I scanned the hallway. I knew old buildings well, where to step, where to not, then shoved Mihaila back, and she hit a deteriorating support column as the violent shaking increased. Chunks of the building fell, bricks cascaded down, pinning her to the ground. Mihaila wailed as I sprinted out of the old school. I made it outside just as the whole building turned to rubble. That night, I visited Adrian. I was relieved to find him waiting in the lobby. He looked better than ever. He smiled and hugged me. The doctors had no idea how he made such a miraculous recovery, and neither did Adrian. Construction crews came and cleared the debris. I explained the situation to Adrian, but he didn't seem to have much recollection of it. No one ever found Mihaila's body, but I did still have her portrait. After Adrian left again for the month, I held a burial for Mihaila, made a little grave for her photo. Maybe it was stupid, but maybe this would help her stay at rest. Me and Adrian left to Cluj-Napoca the following summer. The final photograph I had of Mediosh was of Mihaila's grave. It was a keepsake, a reminder to never go back. Joanna, I also enjoy urban exploring. I'm attracted to older buildings, old churches. There's something about the silence of a place where everybody used to go. I've never run into a surprise visitor. And after your story, I'm very glad that I haven't. Because who knows, for better or for worse, what their intentions are. I'm wondering, out there, would you have given Mahila proper burial like Joanna did, even after everything that happened? I like to think that forgiveness is the best thing, but perhaps Mahila didn't deserve forgiveness in the end. Who says you can't enjoy small town living? They all have their share of local legends, some more frightening than the next, like in this next story, inspired by Mark. I'm an old man now, but I thought I'd share with you a story from when I was a kid. I lived in Saltos del Guerra, on the edge of Paraguay. I know some people don't like the idea of small towns, but I loved mine. Saltos del Guerra had everything I needed. I knew everyone in town, and I loved waking up each day to greet them. Many people saw Saltos de Guerra as a boring town, but there were actually many local legends surrounding the place. Tales of riches hidden beneath the mountains or curses in the river. But my absolute favorite were the stories of monsters. I would hang around the inn in the middle of town and talk to the workers. They'd tell me wild stories of mythical creatures around Paraguay. One of my absolute favorites was the legend of Loezon. Loezon was a monstrous child of two evil spirits, Tao and Carana. The spirits had many evil children, but Loezon was the last and most accursed of the bunch. He looked the way you might view a werewolf, but far more hideous. His skull had the vague shape of a human, but more disfigured with a snout and large canines along his face. He had sickly pale skin hidden underneath long, dirty hair. You knew when Loezon was around, because he reeked of the worst odor you could imagine, a mix of rotting flesh and open sewage. Loezon was the lord of the night and hung around graveyards. This is because the thing he loved to eat the most was rotting flesh. Loezon would feast on the remains of the dead, and once he was finished, he would search for more. If he caught you staring, he would drag you back to his den and snack on you as you rotted away. The worst part? All he had to do was give you one bite, and you'd be marked for death. As a child, I thought Loezon was amazing. He sounded like a tough monster who could take on anything. I loved his ugly description, and I would try drawing him in my textbooks every day. Teachers started noticing and getting angry with me. They didn't like me drawing Loezon over my textbooks, so I got detention a lot. The worst part about detention was it went on for a long time back then. Teachers had nothing better to do. The staff held me there until the sun went down. At the end of detention, the teachers had me promise never to draw Loezon ever again. I agreed. Anything to get out of that stuffy classroom and back home. I left the school at night, but it was so close to home that I wasn't worried. The only thing between school and my home was the cemetery. Normally, I didn't care, but all that talk about Loezon got me imagining his ferocious form. I tried to clear my head and hurried on home. But as I crossed the cemetery gates, I smelled something foul. A horrible stench that wafted through the air. A chill ran down my spine as the wind blew through the area. The cemetery gates groaned as the wind swung them open. But that wasn't the only thing I heard. A tearing of flesh and bone. Maybe it was a wild dog gnawing on a piece of meat. I had to know to get this stupid Loezon out of my head. I took a deep breath, swung the gate open, and entered the cemetery. There, hulking over a freshly dug grave, was a massive beast. It ripped apart a rotting body with its massive fangs, and it smelled worse than its food. It was Louison. I had drawn him so many times, but I wasn't ready for him to look like this. He was beyond hideous. I gagged at the smell, and he darted his snout towards me. He sniffed the area and identified his prey. With a ferocious bark, Louison bounded over to me. I had only one instinct: run. I sped out of there as fast as I could. I saw our house down the road, but I could hear Louison stomping behind me. I didn't want him to be real, but there he was, ready to tear into me. I moved my little legs as fast as I could, but it was too late. With one final leap, Louison was on top of me. He tore into my back, but instead ripped into my backpack. He yanked it off my body, believing he got a piece of me. This gave me the perfect time to make a break towards home. Louison howled as I made a clean escape. As I sprinted towards the door, a truck roared up to stop me in my path. The headlights were bright. I couldn't see who it was. A large group of men jumped out with shovels and sledgehammers. They pushed me behind them as they ran down the road. It was the workers from before who told me the story. I followed them down the path as they chased Louison. They cornered the creature, but he snarled and thrashed through them. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. With a mighty leap, Louison tore a man's throat out. He then bounced off the body quickly and went for another man's hands, ripping them clean off. Tools clattered to the ground. Eventually, the workers outnumbered him. With enough force, they all stabbed away at the beast. With one final blow, a worker took his sledgehammer and smashed Louison into the dirt. It was a horrifying thing to witness as a child, and something I'll never forget. One of the workers took me by the hand and walked me home. I could see behind me the other men carrying their dying colleagues into the graveyard. The worker told me that Saltos de Guerra was safe now, and I didn't have to worry about Louison anymore. Apparently, the men were planning to slay him that night and came rushing in when they saw me sprinting out of the graveyard. Life returned to normal in Saltos de Guerra after Louison was no more. The workers had assured me that I was safe now. Still, I think back to all the other stories they told me, stories of horrible creatures stalking through Paraguay. Were they real too? As I got older, I heard no more tales of Louison, but I wonder if that is because the workers did their job and erased that myth from our history. I thought I'd let it breathe again as I share my tale with you all. Thank you. Wow, Mark, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I'm wondering if anybody else out there has stories that their grandparents have told them, adventures such as confronting a monstrous beast at night. I mean, I know personally I wouldn't investigate a weird sound that I heard, and I would not go into a cemetery, not like Mark did. But if he hadn't, we wouldn't have had this scary story to share tonight. This week's podcast stories were edited by Zach and Brogno, Markia McCarty, Adam Sinker, and Sapphire Sandalo. Audio edited by Johnny Ashley and Fitz Harris. Produced by Annalisa Nelson. Music by Sapphire Sandalo. If you have a story you'd like to submit, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. Don't forget to watch the video version of Something Scary over at youtube.com/snarled. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, join our Patreon at patreon.com/snarled. Until next time, my dark darlings, sweet dreams. Hello, my dark darlings. I'm Markia, and this is the Something Scary podcast. To our veteran listeners and those that are voyaging into the dark with us for the first time, welcome. This week, we return with one of our first ever themes, the ghosts of war. These stories follow those who've encountered horrifying apparitions and paranormal experiences while on the battlefield. Some while on duty, and others long after the fight has ended. First, I'll recount a shocking encounter on a naval warship. Next, we'll work at a Hawaiian motel and learn about a group of deadly ancient warriors. And finally, we'll camp out on a battlefield in Russia and encounter some violent memories. Today's episode was recorded live at LA Comic-Con. Be sure to follow us on social media to find out where we pop up next, and maybe you too can experience the horrors of something scary in person. We receive hundreds of creepy story submissions every single week, and as always, the first story you hear is one that we've chosen to animate over at youtube.com/snarled. Then I read a few more stories for the podcast. If you have a tale you're dying to share, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, consider joining our Patreon. Our patrons play a huge role in keeping the show running every single week. For more information on how you can help the show and also be a part of it, visit patreon.com/snarled. So, want to hear something scary? The Haunting of the USS Forrestal. Ships are always a place where spirits have roamed, especially those that have seen bloody battles. Today's story, inspired by Laura S., is a tale whose ghosts remain. When I was little, my dad loved telling me unbelievable stories, but there was one that he waited to tell me until I was ready, whatever that meant. As always, I was skeptical. The story began on the USS Forrestal, an aircraft carrier for the U.S. Navy, where my dad was stationed in the 1970s. Dad worked night shifts, and along with his best friend, Bruce, took turns making supply runs deep below deck. Most of my dad's runs were to the supply room, a dark, cluttered space where no other crew members ever went. One night, my dad had just entered the supply room when, from the corner of his eye, he saw a man watching him from across the room. Dad turned, but the man was gone. Shaken, Dad grabbed the part he needed and hurried back on deck. He kept what he'd seen to himself, chalking it up to lack of sleep. But that first sighting was only the beginning. Another night, in a different area of the ship, my dad had to travel down an extremely long hallway, so long that it took 15 minutes to go from one side to the other. 5 minutes in, my dad began to smell smoke. He couldn't see any in the air, but the stench was bad enough to make him start coughing. Then he heard a terrible sound. A frantic, choking man was running up to him from down the hall, gasping for air. My dad ran for him and saw that the man's white t-shirt was covered in sweat, his eyes sunken in, his mouth toothless and wrinkled. The man reached for my dad's shoulder, but instead of grabbing it, he passed right through my dad's body. By the time Dad turned around, the man had vanished. Now, Dad really wanted to tell someone what he'd seen, but back on deck, he stayed quiet while Bruce made small talk. Navy men weren't known for being honest about their emotions, Dad explained, especially if it involved fear. Over the months that followed, he continued to have the creepiest encounters, like hearing laughter in the mess hall after hours, seeing boxes tip over on their own in the supply room, and smelling the same odd smell of smoke in the hallway. Some nights, Dad said, Bruce looked stressed like he was seeing the same things too, but still, for fear of sounding crazy, Dad kept it all to himself. Until one night, just before his tour was about to end, while bringing an engine part up to the deck with Bruce, the two saw 4 fellow sailors ablaze, leaping into the ocean. Without a word, they sprang into action and jumped overboard after the men. My dad swam to the nearest sailor. He reached out, expecting to feel the heat from the burned man's hand, but instead, it felt like a block of ice. The sailor barely looked human. His charred skin had all but melted off. He gripped my dad's forearm for just an instant before swell washed over them and the sailor was gone. Searchlights beamed down, rafts hit the water, and my dad and Bruce were rescued. No other sailors were found. The story ended with what Bruce said to my dad. Those men weren't alive, were they? No, Dad replied. I saw something like this before, but I was afraid to ask you about it, he admitted. Same here, Bruce replied. Dad said from then on, when he sees something, he speaks up about it no matter what others might think. As for me, I got Dad's message, but I still didn't believe his story until, as a freshman in high school, I learned that in 1967 there'd been a huge fire on the USS Forrestal. The flames burned for hours, killing 134 crew members, a number of whom died in that long hallway, while several others choked to death from smoke in the supply room. 4 men had also caught fire and jumped overboard. It looks like Dad hadn't made it up, after all.
Warriors will follow tradition, even when they're dead. Be respectful of that, or suffer their wrath. This next story, inspired by Choco, takes us to Hawaii to encounter this very issue. One summer, when I was a teen growing up in Maui, I helped my aunt with a small motel she owned on the western shore. Mostly older locals stayed there, but we'd get adventurous tourists every now and again wanting to get a look at real Hawaii. Most were respectful of our traditions, but not all. It was near the end of the season, and Trent, an obnoxious photographer from New York, came to stay with us for a week. He carried his camera everywhere, getting up close and taking pictures of locals without permission, hiking around looking to capture the real exotic beauty of Maui. I was looking forward to Trent's last day. His major plan was to capture a shot of the night marchers, but so far had not had any luck. Me and my parents had just moved back to Hawaii then, so I'd actually never heard of them. But if I had, I would have warned Trent to stay away. Yep, tomorrow I'm packing up to sell these pictures of paradise, Trent growled. But not before one final shot. I've been hearing about the mystical night watcher thing. Was it night marcher, night watcher, real ghosts? And I'm going to capture it. I just rolled my eyes. Ghosts. I'd let Trent have his fantasies. It was getting late now, and most of the motel patrons were outside by the pool. Then I heard it. A deafening tone from a conch shell. I gripped my temples as the tone drilled further and further into my brain. Finally, it died down, and low chants entered the mix. Did my aunt hire a band tonight? I walked outside to the pool to see what was going on. I nearly tripped as I exited the motel. All the patrons who were outside, they were now lying face down on the ground. It was like they dropped whatever they were doing to fall prone on the floor. I was about to call out when I heard Trent rushing into the trees beside me. "This is it! My big picture!" he exclaimed as he ran into the jungle. I admit I was curious and a little dumb. I ran after him. Each step was echoed with the loud beat of war drums. I burst in on a clearing, and there was Trent in the center of the trees. But he was not alone. Something was in front of him. A whole legion of decaying bodies floating above the ground in full warrior regalia. They looked like the warriors of old, complete with war paint, markings, and garments. Some wore intricate masks and carried skulls. I could see the source of the music. There were men in the back, beating war drums and blowing on conch shells. But they all came to a halt when they encountered Trent. Trent smiled greedily, aimed his camera up into the legion of warriors, and clicked the flash, and the photo was taken. The chief at the front of the vanguard slowly floated in front of Trent. Trent's eyes widened as the chief tore off his mask and stared him down with two cold, dead eyes. Trent stepped backwards, too late, realizing of what he had just done. Wait, I can delete the photo. I'm sorry. Really, he stammered, dropped his camera, but just then the war drums formed, a roll of symphonic tension as the chief's eyes started vibrating like mad. 2 piercing streams of electricity shot from the chief's pupils and into Trent's. Trent shaking violently, mouth dropping open. The vibrant lightning engulfed his body. There was a sudden bright flash, and Trent was gone. The black silhouette of dust hung in the air where he was. I watched as it blew away in the wind. As it disappeared, I saw the chief, now staring at me with that same deathly glare. Without thinking, I dropped to the ground. Putting my arms by my sides, I lay prone. I tried as hard as I could to mimic the patrons of the hotel, to show the proper respect. I could hear the war drums start up again as the Legion floated towards me. The beat of the drums was so violent, it shook the earth around me, and then the drumming ceased. I could feel them there. Was it enough? Suddenly, I heard one of them shout, "No!" It was the Hawaiian word for mine. The drumming resumed, and the music decreased as the warriors moved further from me and into the jungle. And then it was gone. Standing and looking around, all that was left of Trent was his camera. I took it. I ran back to the motel. All the patrons were on their feet now, dusting each other off. My aunt burst out of the main building and came to hug me. I explained what had happened, this thing that had happened, and showed her Trent's camera. She just shook her head. He should not have disturbed them. He even knew the legends and sought to disrupt them, my aunt explained. I went through the camera feed and found the final photograph. It was of the chief who led the vanguard. My aunt gasped as she saw the man's face. This man is one of your ancestors from long ago. Your grandmother was a keeper, or kaku, for his burial cave. I'd recognize those feather garments anywhere. You were saved because he claimed Nau. That way, no harm would come to you. The rest of the week, my aunt taught me how to stay safe with the night marchers. And I pass this on to you. If you encounter the war drums and you hear the conch tones, be careful. Lie prone before them. Hide yourself in Te'i shrubs for better protection. And whatever you do, don't look, or you too will be dust in the wind. That was inspired by Choco. Oh my goodness. Wow. Is anybody familiar with the night marchers, the Hawaiian night marchers at all? This is a very real thing. And the original story that inspired this, it was Choco's mother who ran across it was conch tones and war drums. And then she ran before she saw what would be coming towards her. So we took that and we, inspired by that, we embellished a little bit more with what you're actually supposed to see. I think it is these ancient legends, and then can you imagine having so much tradition that it follows you into the grave, that is viewable for everybody afterwards. Has anybody encountered a ghost of one of their ancestors before? Maybe you have and you don't even realize it. Next time you set up camp, be sure to research the history of the area. You don't want to happen upon a battlefield like in this next story, inspired by Harrison. Living near a battlefield in Russia, I found plenty of bullets in my time. In September of 1812, French and Russian forces met in a battle west of Mazhsk in the Borodino field. Over 70,000 men fell at Borodino, dead or wounded, pierced by artillery shrapnel, bayonets, and most especially the thing that I loved, bullets. The battlefield made a great weekend getaway. I'd set up camp and spend a day or two pacing back and forth through the woods with a metal detector. I was a bit of a history buff, so I loved living through the past. I found a round, tight bullet, signature strafing along the side, partially warped head from impact, but intact. A very rare find indeed. I was quite jovial that night while I packed. I would head out tomorrow with the most profitable find I had uncovered at this site. I made sure to keep it in my inner jacket pocket. But that night, something startled me awake. Looking out of the canvas of my tent, I saw 2 lights floating outside. My heart hammered in my chest. It was silent and eerie. There was no moon above. The lights winked out, then faded back in farther from the tent. Winked out, faded back in farther from the tent. I found a flashlight and pulled out a hatchet from my bag. I scrambled out, heading towards them. As they winked, faded out further away from me. Rushing now towards them, I called out, "Hello?" Then the ghostly lights were rushing back at me. I screamed and started sprinting away. I tripped, crashing through the undergrowth. Then I heard new sounds. They were strange and distorted, like they were coming from underwater. The rattle of buckles and belts, the pounding of hooves on damp earth. The sounds got louder as more images started appearing. Figures with rifles running through the trees. Sounds, distant voices, shouting in pain, crying about death. The figures began fluctuating like heat mirages on the horizon. Curses and pleading, echoes. A scream like an animal in pain pierced the night. When it stopped, someone was standing next to me. It was a soldier, wearing a uniform, white chaps, a blue and red coat. Shocked, I stared. His hands were patting his gut. I looked down. They were patting a large gash in his stomach. He held his wound tight with his hands. Another gunshot exploded near me. The young man whispered something in French. I turned away from him to see more men. These ones wearing thick green uniforms. They came running through the trees, yelling in Russian. One held a rifle at me, while 2 others rushed over, slowly raising their weapons. I was standing between them and the French soldier behind me. The one who at first raised his weapon chuckled, then sneered at me, saying something in Russian. A great white flash burst over my face. My heart pounded. But then the light faded, and I found myself alone in an empty forest. It was morning. I was the only one there. I ran back to my campsite. I had lived through a war memory. I had felt the Battle of Borodino. But who would believe me? Who would believe me? No one. I returned to a corner store, grabbed more supplies, a camera this time. I went right back to the field and I found the clearing that the ghost lights had led me to. I would keep searching. The past was alive. I was going to live more battles like no one else could, and I would bring back proof this time. Thank you, Harrison, for that story. Has anybody been to any of the old battlefields, like anywhere? Have you walked around? I personally haven't because I'm sensitive, and I'm sensitive to areas that have like a lot of violent history, or there's some places that you couldn't pay me money to go to, and battlefields kind of tend to be one of them. Anybody else in here maybe a little sensitive in that way, where you can feel when you're somewhere where it's just like, well, I don't really belong here and I don't think I'm going to stay? Please step on up.
My name's Nick.
Hey, Nick.
So I was about 13 visiting Idaho, visiting some family, and we decided to go to a abandoned prison.
Okay. That was a decision.
Yeah. The whole time, I felt something weird. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. I was getting chills every now and then. The places where I really felt something, just like a really bad feeling in my gut, was in solitary confinement
Oof.
and where they would hang people.
Oh gosh. Wow.
And I actually almost got a panic attack from it.
I'd imagine so.
I've never gotten a panic attack before. I don't have any anxiety or anything like that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No. Thank you, Nick, for sharing. Most definitely, places like that, especially with solitary confinement, the mental anguish that must be like painted on those walls. That's not going to go away. I mean, that's probably going to, even if you tore down the prison, that would be embedded in the ground. I mean, we're very powerful beings, like the energy that we have, and it imprints upon everything. That's also probably why conventions feel so good, because we're all happy and we're cosplaying and we're just like sharing our nerdery and everything. So yeah, along with places that can cause great anxiety like that, there are places that cause great joy. One of the things that when I travel, I'm very attracted to older spaces. I don't go to the ones that don't want me to go to them. I respect that and recognize